Hello everybody, my name is Cara, and today I'm here with my most surprising books of 2018. So these are going to be some books that I really enjoyed and that surprised me in one way or another. So I'm going to go in chronological order of when I read these books because it doesn't really make sense to me to rank them. And the first one is 1,000 Nights by E.K. Johnston. This is a retelling of 1001 Nights, and I just loved this. I loved the emphasis on female-focused storytelling and on women's work, kind of traditionally feminine things and hobbies and how those have value. I really loved the fairy tale writing style of this, and it was amazing how much I loved the main character, considering that we never actually learn her name. That's kind of an important element in the story too. And the reason I was so surprised by this is because this has pretty bad reviews, and I had actually read a very popular retelling of this story called The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh, which I despised. I wasn't sure how I was gonna feel about this one. I was like, man, if this has worse reviews than that one, am I not gonna like it? But I freaking love this. Everything about it just really worked for me in a way that The Wrath and the Dawn didn't. And also, this doesn't really have like a romance angle, really, which I think was a really cool take on 1001 Nights, because it's something that has always kind of bothered me. Like, not to say that you can't do that aspect of it well, but I think this book took it in a different direction, and I really enjoyed that. Next was Bryony and Roses by T. Kingfisher. Now this was actually in one of my 5-star TBR predictions, so it wasn't like I expected not to like this, but this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it's very short. I have mentioned it several times as like, this would be a great kind of fairy tale retelling starter kit almost, because it's so short and engaging. But the reason I was surprised by this one is because I had this feeling that T. Kingfisher could be like a favorite author for me, but I had never heard anyone talk about her or review her or anything like that. But I read this and I loved it. And I have actually recently read another book by her, which you will see in an upcoming wrap-up, which I also loved. So I think she's like an auto-buy author for me, and it was just so nice to have that kind of that instinct about her as an author like proved correct. I guess I haven't told you what I actually enjoyed about this book. I absolutely loved the main character Bryony. I think she was a really great like strong female character who's actually strong and not just like stupid and running into danger. I think she was really funny and clever, and I really loved the writing of this book. I think T. Kingfisher has a great talent for balancing beautiful passages with humor and with great characterization. Like, her characters always feel real, even in the midst of these like really strange magical kind of folklore stories. And I also loved the relationship between the Beauty and the Beast characters, and that's of course very important in one of these retellings. I think I ended up giving it 4.5 stars because there was this one thing about the ending that I didn't absolutely adore, but highly recommend nevertheless. So next, I have a couple of rereads. And the first one is Beastkeeper by Kat Hellison. I reread this for the BookTuber Readathon project, and I think the prompt was to reread a book that you had mixed feelings on or that confused you, something like that. And I had mixed feelings about this book, and it confused me. I think I gave it 3 stars the first time I read it, but I didn't unhaul it. And that's kind of key because 3-star books tend to get unhauled pretty much immediately for me at this point. And there was something about this one that I didn't really want to unhaul it yet, but I had almost unhauled it a couple of times, and I finally decided to give it another chance. This book was amazing. This is like a middle grade, really dark kind of Beauty and the Beast retelling, but not really. Like, there are a lot of other kind of fairy tale feelings woven into this as well, and it's actually like a gender swapped Beauty and the Beast, which I really enjoyed. But like, it's not really a romance focused one, even though like the theme of love and like caring about people and what that can, like how that can change people and what it can make them do, I think that's definitely a really important theme of this book, but it's not really a romantic one. So if that's something you're not really into, I think you could really enjoy this. But I love the writing. I love the dark strangeness of this world. So if you like weird, dark, strange fairy tales, this could be right up your alley. And I'm so glad I gave it a second chance and reread it. And then the other one I want to mention for the reread thing, I just want to talk about briefly, and that is Book of Enchantments by Patricia C. Reed. This is a short story collection that, again, I had almost unhauled, but on rereading it, I had so many favorite stories from this collection. I actually have a full review where I give some kind of bullet points about each story and about what I enjoyed about them and why I would recommend them. So again, I will leave that link below, but I just absolutely loved this, and it kind of opened my eyes to the possibility of finding more short story collections that I really enjoy, because that's not a format I tend to get along with. But earlier in the year, I also read The Ladies of Grace Adieu by Susanna Clarke, which actually I meant to put on this list, but I think we're out of order at this point. It's fine, we're gonna talk about it now. Those are short stories set in the world of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and again, I loved it. I was not expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. There were a few that I still think about, and I'm really looking forward to rereading that collection at some point, but those two experiences were kind of the ones that made me realize that I can actually enjoy short story collections. Like that's a format that I can actually get a lot out of if I find the right author and the right content. Next I have Marisi by Maria Tochaninoff, and this is translated by AA Prime. So there was a period during the year where I was talking pretty much incessantly about this series. I will leave my feminist fantasy recommendations video down below because I go a lot more in depth on this series, and especially about like content warnings because it gets very dark at times. But this is a book that completely blew me away because again, I had almost unhauled it. I actually had an ARC copy that I picked up somewhere. I almost got rid of it, but something about it, I was like, you know, this still sounds kind of interesting. It'll probably be like 3.5 stars. It'll be like, okay. Loved it, clearly. It's on this list. I immediately after finishing it ordered the finished copy and the finished copy of the sequel, which is also fantastic. And this is just such an incredible, like female-centric fantasy series about the power of women working together, and I love the magic and the world and this Red Abbey setting, especially in this first book where we get to spend a lot of time there. And it's about friendship, and it takes place at an abbey that is like a safe haven for women and girls who are fleeing hardship, and especially if it's inflicted by men. And just the atmosphere and the relationships between these women is just so wonderful and so important, and I highly recommend this series. I really encourage you to check out the recommendations video I mentioned because again there are some content warnings for especially the second book that get very heavy. This series is so fantastic. I'm so excited to read the third book, and this was also the book that got me into really like seeking out translated fiction in a way that I hadn't before, so there's just so many things about this book that surprised me and that I love. Next I have Deathless by Catherine M. Valente. This is a retelling of the Koshi the Deathless story. I don't think I pronounced that right, I'm sorry. That incorporates a lot of Russian folklore, and Catherine M. Valente has become one of my favorite authors, I think, at this point. And I went into this book kind of hesitant because I had heard a lot of like mixed things about it. People generally agreed that the world was great and that the folklore aspect was great, but a lot of people just didn't enjoy this book. And I was kind of nervous about it, but I finally decided, you know, I think even if I don't love it, I think it's a book that's going to have some kind of effect on me. Like I think it's going to be something I think about a lot. And I read it and I loved it. This is just such a dark and twisted story. It's so messed up in a lot of ways. My friend Jocelyn and I were talking about this because she loves Catherine M. Valente too, and she loves Deathless. And we were talking about how Catherine M. Valente has this way of like writing these really messed up relationships where you're like kind of into it, but you feel like a bad person for being kind of into it. And it's just like a really interesting dynamic. I mentioned in my wrap up, I'm not technically sure how I would categorize the main romantic relationship in this book, because like the reason I hesitate to call it an abusive relationship is because there's not the consistent unequal power dynamics. Like it flips back and forth between who has more of the power in the relationship. And I'm not saying that's like healthy in any way, but I'm just saying there are some things about it where I'm not sure how to like categorize it, I guess, or how to warn people about the content, but it's definitely very dark and twisted. Absolutely love Catherine M. Valente's writing style. I love some of the side characters I just got so attached to in this book. But this is definitely a book that's not for everyone. I can absolutely see why it has very mixed reviews, but this book was kind of one of the ones that made me realize once and for all that strange, like dark, borderline messed up fairy tale, folklore, fantasy books, those kinds of things are things that tend to really work for me. Like this one and Beastkeeper, I guess, were kind of the two of the ones that did that for me this year. So yeah, I guess that's my thing. The next book I have to talk about I own, but I can't actually find my copy of at the moment, and that is Grounded by Megan Morrison. I think the subtitle is like The Adventures of Rapunzel or something like that. And I went into this thinking this was going to be like a fun, light fairy tale retelling. Not that it wasn't going to have any depth, but I wasn't expecting as much of an emotional impact from this book as I got. And it was brilliant. I really love the character development of Rapunzel, and I know a lot of people DNF'd this book pretty early on because of how sheltered and frustrating she was, but I think if you can stick it out, it all pays off so beautifully. Like there are so many reasons for why Rapunzel is the way she is, and I found that she was willing to change as she experienced more of the world and as she got to meet more people, and I thought that was really beautifully done. And I like the ending of this book made me cry, and although like I'm definitely not it's definitely not like unusual for books I enjoy to make me cry, I was not expecting it from this one because again, I didn't go into this thinking it would be a really emotional reading experience, but it was, and I loved it. I loved the characters. I really enjoyed the world and how there's so many more layers to the world than you think when you start it, because it seems very like light and fun and like, oh, all the kingdoms are named after colors. This is going to be a really like cutesy kind of fairy tale book. And it's not. It's really not. There are so many important thematic elements about love and acceptance and freedom and like the power to choose things. And I highly recommend it. Next, I have Saints and Misfits by S.K. Ali. This is an Own Voices Muslim book about a girl named Jana who is sexually assaulted by a boy at her mosque who is very well loved, well respected. Nobody would believe her, basically, that this boy would do this to her. And the reason this one surprised me is because despite many kind of surface level differences between Jana and myself, I connected to her so deeply on a very personal level. I think this book is a fantastic example of how, like, for one thing, why it's important to read about people different from yourself, but also how you can still find bits of yourself in people who you wouldn't necessarily think you had much in common with, again, on like kind of a superficial level, which is not to say that if I hadn't connected to Jana personally, this wouldn't be as good of a book or wouldn't be as important. That's not what I'm saying, but I just think this was such a wonderful example of the way that you can't always predict which books and which characters are going to really speak to you in ways that you didn't expect. I really love how real this book felt and how complicated Jana's relationships were, and the ways she responded to people and to things were like, it like felt realistic because of how it didn't always fit like a narrative that you would expect, you know? It's like sometimes you read contemporaries and it's like, oh, this is going to be the character who helps her realize this about herself, you know? Which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think with this one, some of it was surprising and I liked that. And this was a really fantastic book. There were some things about the writing that I mentioned in my wrap up kind of threw me off at the beginning, but I think that went away as the book went on, and everything else about this book I really loved, and I'm really excited for S.K. Ali's new release, which is coming out this year, and highly recommend. Again, this is a book that made me sob multiple times, completely unexpectedly. It wasn't even at a part of the book where I was expecting there to, like, it wasn't like a particularly emotional scene necessarily. Like, it wasn't a part that you would expect to have that reaction to, but yeah, brought me to tears. It was great. Next, I have Wild Beauty by Anna Marie McLemore. This is a magical realism story about a family of women who all have power over flowers, like that's their magic. And the reason this surprised me is because a couple years ago when this book came out, maybe it was just 1 year ago, people were talking about it. I heard the synopsis over and over and over. And it just, like, it didn't really appeal to me at the moment. I was like, okay, I might give that one a miss. But I ended up picking it up for the Latinx-a-thon and for the Latinx Book Bingo. This is basically one of my favorite books of the year. Anna Marie McLemore has become an auto-buy author for me now. This was just so beautiful, and again, this was a very emotional book that I wasn't necessarily expecting to be really emotional, but I loved the characters. I loved the writing and how dreamlike and lovely it was while not getting oversaturated, you know? I just absolutely adored this. Next, I have Surprised by God by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, and this surprised me because I've never been super into memoirs. Like, that's never been something I've been interested in, but I follow Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg on Twitter, and I have really enjoyed some of her articles and other writings, so I thought I'd read one of her books. And this is about her experience. I'll actually link the wrap-up where I talk about this book down below because I actually give, like, the full synopsis, or not synopsis, but, like, the description that the book gives you on the back, the overview of her life story. And I thought this was fantastic. I thought it was so well written. I thought it was such a really interesting look at having a religious or spiritual practice in such a modern world and the difficulties that brings. You know, there's benefits too, but it's definitely not an easy thing. And I think that she described that so beautifully. I think this is definitely a book you can get a lot out of with varying religious backgrounds. She's also a fantastic writer. Like, I think she's got a great amount of humor and wit, and she's really beautifully descriptive when the situation calls for it, but it doesn't kind of overtake the importance of what she's saying, and I just thought this was brilliant. Next, I have An Assassin's Guide to Love and Treason by Virginia Baker, and I heard absolutely nothing about this book, and I thought this was amazing. Like, this was so good, and it's such a sleeper hit because, again, no one is talking about this, but I thought it was fantastic. So we follow two main characters. The girl's named Catherine, and her father is actually killed during a raid on their house because they are Catholic, and this is during the time in England where the tensions between Catholics and Protestants were at their highest. And so she decides she's going to avenge his death by helping to assassinate the queen. And then the male character, Toby, like, he works on plays, and he sort of is on, like, a spy for the other side, and they end up working together on a production of Twelfth Night, and I thought this was so well done. I loved the setting and how well that was constructed. I really liked the characters and their interactions. Toby's also bisexual, and I think that was handled really well, and I just really enjoyed the theater aspects. Those were a lot of fun and really interesting. And I also really liked that there was this underlying feeling of fear and darkness. Like, this wasn't just a lighthearted romp where you fall in love with the enemy, although there were those fun aspects of it. Like, you really got the feeling of like the fear that these characters live in all the time. And I think that was just handled very honestly and very well, and I highly recommend this. I think you can enjoy it even if you're not into historical fiction usually, and you don't have to be a Shakespeare fan, but I think that if you do like Shakespeare, I think this could be like extra interesting for you. Next, I have The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. So there's this village where every year they leave a baby out as a sacrifice for the witch, and unbeknownst to them, the witch is actually a good witch, and she doesn't know why the village leaves this baby, but she always takes care of them and brings them to a loving family. And one day she accidentally feeds a baby moonlight instead of starlight, and this sets in motion a chain of events because that is incredibly powerful magically, and the story all kind of goes from there. And there are multiple kind of story threads that connect, and through that we see a lot of different perspectives on memory and loss and grief, and just really important topics that I think are handled in a way that never feels over dramatic or cheesy or anything. I just think it was really woven into the story beautifully. I really loved the writing. I really grew to love some of the characters. And I do want to mention for this book though, my good friend Kelly from Cozy Reader Kelly, she mentioned this book in a video which I will link down below, and she talked about the perspective on adoption in this book and how that's really like it's actually portrayed quite negatively in some areas. This would probably not be an ideal book for children who are part of an adopted family because of the way that some of that is done. So I will link that down below. Keep that in mind if you read this book. I don't have that same perspective, so I didn't feel that way from this book. So I just want you to have that information if that could affect you. Last but not least, I have The Enchanted Sonata by Heather Dixon Woolwork. This is another one I talked about in my December wrap up, but this is a Pied Piper / Nutcracker retelling, and I was just blown away by how well done this was, by how much I enjoyed the characters and the writing and the relationships, and like especially the side character relationships were like so good. I loved them so much. And this is another book where there's like surprising undercurrents of darkness. And I really loved the way that the music was used and handled in this book, and I just had so much fun like reading this book, and I could see this becoming like an annual Christmas time tradition for me to reread this book because I just enjoyed it so immensely. Not that you have to read this book at Christmas time, but I think that was like an extra fun aspect of it for me this year, and this is actually a present from my wonderful friend Kevin at Storyglib, so thank you, Kevin. So those are some books that I absolutely loved this year that surprised me for one reason or another. Let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you plan to read any of them, and let me know if there was a book that surprised you this year. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!